This is going to be the first video of a three-part video series on how to ingest and enrich data using Elasticsearch. So if you don't know what data enrichment means, then I'd simply define it as taking one set of data and combining it with other sources of data so that the final data set has extra information for other people to work with. If that still doesn't make sense, here's an example that should clarify things. Imagine you work in a company and the sales department gives you a CSV file. The CSV file is called registration.csv, and in that file are just two columns, email and paid amount. If you were to take one row from that CSV file and express it as a JSON object, it might look something like this. And let's say that in your company, you actually have a database of past customers. And that database has fields like email, first name, last name, city, country, zip, and web. If you were to take one row from this customer table and express it as a JSON object, it might look something like this. Now the problem is that the customer database and your registration CSV file are two different data sets, and this makes it difficult for your other team members to gain any behavioral or demographic insight. The process of data enrichment is to ultimately end up with one data set so that each registration has all the data you need to glean insight into your customer. Kind of like this object here on the right, where you have the original registration information along with information from your customer database. So this video series will focus on how to use Elasticsearch to accomplish data enrichment. As mentioned earlier, this is going to be a three-part video series. This video is part one, and in this video, I will give an overview of the data enrichment process in Elasticsearch. Then I will go through some basic code examples from the Elasticsearch website. Tomorrow, I will upload part two, and it will be a practical demonstration using a conference or event registration scenario. We will practice data enrichment by uploading CSV files through Kibana. And the day after tomorrow, I will upload part three, which will be a practical demonstration using an e-commerce scenario. We will automate the data enrichment process with Logstash. So if you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, you should be notified as soon as part two and part three are uploaded. And if you find this video helpful, then press the like button so that we know we're doing a reasonable job with these tutorials. So let me start by giving a high-level overview of the data enrichment process within Elasticsearch. And I think this diagram down here is a pretty good illustration. We'll start with the pink boxes here on the right. They're what Elasticsearch calls source indices. So an example of a source index could be this customer database that we talked about a few seconds ago. If we were to import this customer content into Elasticsearch as an index, it would become a source index. And we use source indices to enrich incoming documents with data. So an incoming document would be the registration.csv file, or as denoted in this illustration, this blue box over here. But coming back to this, to the source indices here on the right, in order to use the source index as enriching data, we need to programmatically set up something called enrich policy, or one or several enrich policies. The objective of an enrich policy is to say, in your source index, which field do we want to match on? So we want to use the email field as an identifier to match against incoming documents. So let's say match against the registration.email. If you come from a relational database background, you can think of it as a join. The enrich policy is saying we want to join on the email field. The enrich policy also needs to specify which fields do we want to enrich with. So the enrich policy will say, I want to pass over the first name, last name, city, country, zip, and web into the registration incoming documents. So that's the purpose of the enrich policy, to state which field to match or join on and which fields to use for enriching purposes. Once we set up the enrich policy, we tell Elasticsearch to generate an enrich index. So an enrich index is an index that is something that's behind the scenes and completely managed by Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is going to use it for an ingestion pipeline that we will be setting up. So the ingestion pipeline is where kind of all the magic happens. The ingestion pipeline takes your incoming documents, it takes the instructions from your enrich policy and the content from your enrich index to generate the enriched documents that we ultimately load into our final target index. And the ingestion pipeline is also something that we need to programmatically define. And that's basically all there is at a high level to how the data enrichment process works in Elasticsearch. Before we begin, make sure you have Kibana and Elasticsearch installed. If you don't know how to do that, I'll leave a link in the description of this video to another video that shows you the steps on how to do the installation. Let's start with some basic examples straight from the Elasticsearch website. The first example is to enrich incoming data with a policy that matches incoming data with source data using an exact value. I think this is the easiest example to start with. So just a reminder, there are 4 steps to all this. Step 1 is set up a source index. Step 2, set up an enrichment policy. Step 3, set up an ingestion pipeline. And finally, step 4, insert documents using the ingestion pipeline. And what I have highlighted here is step 1. So step 1 is to set up the source index. Now, I don't have a source index set up yet, but what this command will do is that it's going to insert this document into an index called users. But because I don't have the users index set up yet at all, Elasticsearch will automatically create it just because I ran this command. And Elasticsearch will do its automatic mapping for each of these fields. So I believe Elasticsearch is probably going to make these all keyword fields. Except for this one, it'll probably be a numeric field of some kind. So let's go ahead and just run this command. I'm going to copy this, go to my Elasticsearch. Let's go down to DevTools. I will delete this, paste this in here, and let's just run it. Oh, no, oh, there we go. All right, and we can confirm that this index exists because if I scroll all the way down to Stack Management, let's just open this in a new tab. And then I'll click to Index Management. You can see that there is now a new index here, which we're going to use as our source index for enriching data. One document has been inserted. Okay, so step 1 is complete. Let's move on. So now we're on to step 2, which is to set up an enrichment policy. And what this policy will do is that it gives instructions on how to populate incoming data with data from the source index. So let's take a look at what this policy says. We're going to name this policy users-policy. It's going to say use data from the users index. We're going to match on the email field. So that's this field here. And then we're going to populate incoming documents with data from the source index on these fields. So we're going to pluck out first name, last name, city, zip, and state, and throw them into an incoming document. Basically, we're just going to ignore the county field and the web field. So let's actually set up that policy. Copy, and let's paste it in here like this. And that should be good. Now let's take a look at the next step, which is, don't forget to execute your policy. So what the execute does is that when you set up a policy, you also need to set up a behind the scenes enrichment index. So the enrichment index is something that Elasticsearch completely manages. It's derived from your source index. So our source index is basically users. Anytime you insert documents into your users index, you should run the execute on your policy because that updates your enrichment index with the latest content from your source index. If you don't run your execute, then your enrichment index might not have the latest information. So you can batch or bulk load your source index first, run the execute, and next time you have more documents, placed into your user's source index, then you run the execute again. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and execute the policy so that it sets up or updates the enrichment index. Great, it's complete. And to confirm everything is working properly, here on this index management, you should see a new index here called Enrich policies or something of that nature. Oh, it's going to be hidden actually. Here it is. Here's the new Enrich index that is derived from your user's source index over here. So just remember that anytime you add documents to user's index or update it, if you want that data to be available to you for enrichment purposes, make sure you run this execute command so that this index is updated. So let's move on to the next step, which is step 3. And step 3 is to set up an ingestion pipeline. And what the ingestion pipeline does is that it tells Elasticsearch which policy to use or which enrichment policy to use to enrich incoming documents with. So let's take a look at how this works. This command is saying set up an ingestion pipeline called user lookup. And we're going to use the user's policy, which is this policy that we created here. And we're going to match on the email field. Now, this email field is referencing this last step here. So this is step 4, which is insert a document with just the email. Okay. Now, this ingestion pipeline is saying take the email field which is this email field, and relate it back to the user's policy. And our user policy says use this email field, which is this email field. And that's how the match happens, and that's how the enrichment will work. So once the match happens, we're going to take the enriched data, which is the first name, last name, zip, state, and something else, I think, I forget. But take those fields and dump it into a nested field called user. And it's possible that there could be multiple emails returned, multiple users returned because they might have the same email. If that's the case, just return one document only. So that's what this pipeline is instructing Elasticsearch to do. So I'm going to copy this and I'll paste it in here. And let's run this command so that it sets up the ingestion pipeline. Good, that seemed to have worked. And what we can do is, if I click on ingestion pipelines here, we should see here it is. So this is the name of our ingestion pipeline. And you can see this is exactly the instructions that we created over here. And now we're on to the last step, step 4, which is just test that this all works. We're gonna insert a new document called with just a field email. Now, when we create that document, it's going to be in the index called my index, lots of zeros and 1. And we're going to say explicitly, use this ingestion pipeline that we just set up. All right. If you don't use this pipeline, then we're not going to get the enriched data. Okay. So let's test this out. And I will paste it in here. Oops. Okay, it's inserted. Now, if I do a get my index and do a search, you can see there, this nested field users. So you can see over here, we mentioned that we want to throw the enriched data in a nested field called user. You can see in here, we have the 5 fields that we were hoping to get. Now there's one more thing I want to do, which is let's insert another document into our source index. So I'm going to take this and I'll do a post statement instead. I'll let it auto increment. Let's change the email to and I'll change just the first name. Okay, let's insert this document to our source index, which we can use as enrichment data. And now let's insert another document into our regular index, into our myIndex01. I'll also make this a post statement. And we will definitely use the pipeline user lookup. And I'm going to use test@test.com so that it uses this, so that the pipeline finds this email through the policy. Let's insert it. Okay, so that seemed to have been okay. And now, if I do a search, all right, 2 records came back. So this was our earlier attempt. This is our latest document, but you'll notice that we don't have the user attribute here with the enriched data. And that's because even though we inserted a record into our source index, our enrichment index doesn't have the latest data yet because we forgot to run the execute command. So I will run the execute command now, and now our enrichment index should be up to date with the content from the source index. And if I insert another record to myIndex1, and then I do a search, now 3 documents come back, and our most recent document is this one, test@test.com, and it does have the user field with the enriched data. Our previous one still does not have the user attribute with the enriched data, and our first document that we created still has it. Okay, so just remember to run the execute command if you've updated your source index, or if you want content from your source index to be picked up on the next enrichment process. And that's basically all there is to enriching data using an exact value match. So let's move on to the next example. In this example, we are going to enrich incoming data by matching a field through a range of values. And this process is almost identical to our previous example, so we should get through this pretty quickly. The first thing we need to do is set up an index, which we can do with this command. And this command is basically stating a mapping that says we need 3 fields: the department field, name field, and the range field. So department and name, they're pretty straightforward, they're just strings, or I mean keyword fields. This field here, the range field, is going to be of the type IP range. So let me pull up some documentation for this. So you can see that there are many different range field types, and the one that we're using right now is the IP range. And in a future scenario, I believe I'm going to use the integer range, or maybe it's the long range. I can't quite remember at this point in time. But yeah, for now, we're going to use the IP range, and it's going to be pretty evident on how it works as we go through this exercise. So for now, let's just acknowledge that we're going to use it. So let's go ahead and take this mapping and paste it into our dev tools over here. Let me just do this and paste it in here. All right, and let's set up our index. Okay, so the index has been made. Now, one other point I want to make is that this time we actually have to initialize our index by specifying a mapping. But in our previous exercise, we didn't have to specify the mapping. We just inserted the documents. So if we come back over here for a moment, you can see that all we did was just insert this document, and that automatically set up our index. And that's because every one of these fields is quite primitive or straightforward or pretty simple. They're all just text or numeric. And Elasticsearch is smart enough to automatically map those. But this network's index has this field here, which is more complicated, and we need to explicitly specify that mapping to make sure that the range field is of the type IP range. So that's why we actually have to state our mapping first this time. So let's go back to our exercise. So now let's insert a document into our networks index, and we're going to do it with this command here. And these two fields here, department and name, pretty straightforward, just production, OPS, they're string or keyword fields. But this field here, range, is going to take the value 10.100.0.0/16, and these trailing 0.0 is basically the wildcard, or where the range would occur. So later on, when we do a search for, let's say, something that's 10.100.5, right, it will actually return this document because that 5 fits in the range of this wildcard 0. All right, so let's go ahead and insert this document. All right, let me click on this. All right, so this document is now in our source index called networks. And moving on to the next step, you know what, I'll close these so we don't get confused. All right, moving on to the next step. Let's set up a policy. And this policy is saying let's use the index called networks, which is this index here. And we're going to match on the field called range, which is this range field that we already created. And we're going to enrich with the name and department fields. So that's the name and the department field. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our policy. I will hit run. Okay, and we can confirm that this policy has been made. In fact, maybe I shouldn't have closed that tab, because we will use it to confirm that anytime an enrichment index is made, that it actually appears here. So let's go to index management. Let's show all the hidden indices, and we should see an enrich. Oh wait, we won't see it yet until this next command over here, right? So let's execute our policy so that it sets up the enrichment index. Now I will press reload. And there we go. We see the new enrichment index for networks is there. And let's move on to the next step, which is to set up an ingestion pipeline. So you can see that we're going to set up a pipeline called networks lookup. And it's going to reference the networks policy, which is what we just made. We're going to map on the IP field because you can see in the final step, we're going to insert a document with just this IP value. And when we insert this document, the field is IP, so this field must map to this field. Okay, and when we're enriching, we're going to place the enriched data into a nested field called networks. We'll return up to 10 matches. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up this ingestion pipeline. Okay, that seems good. We should be able to click on ingestion pipeline and we should see it here as well. Yep, this is exactly what we pasted in. And now let's actually insert a document into our target, into a new index. Yeah, we'll put it into another index called index 02 and make sure that everything that we've done in the previous steps actually work by verifying that enrichment data is actually there. So let's go over here. I'll paste this in here and I'll make it a new index. And we're going to use the pipeline networks lookup. All right, that's good. And now let's take a search. Let's do a search. My index number 2. Do a search here. And we see There we go. We've been enriched with this IP range 10.100 0.0/16 in here. And that's pretty much all there is for the IP range, for the range enrichment process. So let's go to our final example, which is to enrich data by matching on geographic data. This is almost like the previous example of matching on a ranged value, except this time we are trying to see if a geographic point falls within a geographic shape. Specifically, seeing if a point defined by longitude and latitude falls within a two-dimensional geographic surface. So we'll set up a source index of postal codes with geographic shapes. Then Elastic will try to match incoming documents that have a longitude and latitude to a postal code if the incoming document's longitude and latitude falls within the geographic area of the postal code. So we'll start with step 1, which is to define the index called postal codes, because we're going to use postal codes as our source index. And we have to define the mappings ourselves because of this specific field here, which is of type geoshape, which is not a straightforward primitive data type like a string or a numeric field. The postal code is just a string, it's a keyword field. So that's pretty straightforward, but not the location. So let's set up our index, which is called postal codes. Okay, so the source index has been set up, and moving on, let's add one record to our source index. So this is going to add the postal code 96598, and we're going to add the geographic shape defined by a northwest point and a southeast point. It's going to be of the type envelope. So let's do that. Okay. Moving on to the next step. We're going to create a policy. All right, so the policy is saying we're going to use the postal codes index. We're going to match on the field location. So this index, we're going to match on this location field, and we're going to enrich with both the location field and the postal code field, which we already have defined in here, as you can see over here as well. So let's go ahead and create that policy. All right, and with that policy made, we should run the execute command to make sure the enrich index is set up. Okay, and let's double check that the enrich index is there. Show the hidden ones. Let's find our enrich index. Here it is, with one document in there. Okay, yeah, all these details look good to me. Okay, moving on to the next step, which is the final one. We're going to set up the pipeline, the ingestion pipeline. The ingestion pipeline is going to be called postal code lookup. We're going to use the policy name called postal policy, which is this over here. We're going to match on geolocation field because later on, we're going to create a new user document that has a geolocation field. So this field must match this field. And with the postal policy is saying match this location field with this location field. So this matches to here. This now matches to this policy over here, which then matches to this field, which then matches to this field. Okay, so and all the enriched data will go in a nested field called geodata. All right, let's set up this ingestion pipeline. run it, and we should see it available under here now. Postal code lookup, which is exactly what we just pasted into our dev area. Okay, so everything should be set up. Let's see if once we insert this record, if a new nested field appears with the postal code information. Okay, I already have a user's index, and rather than mix it in with the one that we already set up earlier, I'll call this one users to index. And let's see, pipeline. Yeah, okay. All right, let's see if this works. Okay, and now if we do a search, let's see if it got enriched with the geographic information. And yes, we see it right here. There is now a new field here called geodata, and inside is the enriched data. And this was the field that came with our original document. So those are all the basic examples of data enrichment in Elasticsearch. Tomorrow I will upload part 2, which will have a more realistic scenario that we will run through, where we have multiple source indices and we'll be uploading CSV files through Kibana. So if you subscribe to our channel and you press the notification bell, you should be notified as soon as part 2 is ready. And also, if you found this video helpful, then press the like button so it tells us that we're doing a reasonable job with these tutorials. So we'll see you in the next video.